Again, we're going to go through this histology one again. For any particular layer, I may ask any of these. Again, I'll try to make it the most clear examples, right? Not do something obscure because some of them are not so easy to tell. So first, we're going to start off in the mouth. I just thought the tongue is interesting. Over here, this is MH108. Again, everybody knows at this point, histology guide, slide box, chapter 14 is where everything is. All right, so we're going to the first one, MH108. And this is a cross section of the tongue, right? The tongue is mostly down here is all skeletal muscles because it's all voluntary control stuff right here, right? Then you also have glands within here. There's two types of glands down there. These are the minor salivary glands, which are secreting out onto the ducts over here, serous and mucus glands. All right, so if you look over here, right, this is all skeletal muscle around here. These are the two types of glands. So these are over here are the mucus glands, right? They're kind of big and white. They're kind of clear over here, whereas these are the serous glands that are going to contain the digestive enzymes, right? So all together, they'll make up the saliva. And they might be separate, they might be mixed, but I'd show them like this so you could kind of tell them apart between the two. Just remember which one is which. All this is skeletal muscle, all the different kind of angles going through it. It's pretty complicated. And we're going to move up toward the surface. These are some of the ducts that lead in, right? And then you got these furrows over here. In the furrows are the taste buds themselves. Right, so food, all your digested, the saliva stuff in the saliva is flowing through here, and they're taken up. Some of the stuff is taken up by these little taste buds. Right, taste buds have things like receptors for salt, sweet tea, MSG, bitter. Right, they're in different regions of the tongue. There's some anatomical difference in the regions of your tongue which detect each thing, but that's where you're getting your sense of taste. Right, so they'd be picked up by your nerves over there and brought into your nervous system. These are the taste buds themselves. Okay, and then moving out. Right, the surface, just like all your mouth and your esophagus, is going to be lined with that stratified squamous, right? So this kind of looks like your skin a little bit. It's even got dermal papilla. Right over here, but that'll be a stratified squamous dry, number one, because stratified squamous wet won't be on your practical, right? But these will be, right? The living squamous cells. So that's what you're looking at there. All right, so that's your tongue over there. So going back to the next region over there, we're going to move into the esophagus. This is a longitudinal view over here with the stratified squamous that you could see from afar. You can see the stratified squamous. You can make out this muscularis mucosa. So this would be the region of the mucosal layer with the lamina propria in between there. And then this would be the submucosa. From way back, you could see some of these salivary glands, the mucus glands, sorry, the submucosal glands. Here, if you look closely, right, all this will be the connective tissue with all the big blood vessels and stuff inside the mucosa. Right, that's what we want to identify in this section, right? The submucosal glands, which means you're in the submucosa, right? And then the stratified squamous. The other stuff, even the muscularis mucosa is thicker than you'd mostly see it. It's kind of broken up, so it's kind of hard to pick out. But at some point, you do want to be able to recognize, you're going to want to be able to see the transition from a collagen layer, like a connective tissue layer, which would be the submucosa, and then a transition into the smooth muscle layer, right? Even if you can't tell exactly what's going on, you can see there's a difference between over here and over here. Can you? This would be the submucosa. I can't draw because I have to draw with my fingers, but that would be the submucosa. And then this would be the inner layer, or the circularis muscle of the muscularis. externa, right? So the tissue here would be smooth muscle. Tissue would be connective tissue, right? Connective tissue, that'll be good enough for our purposes. It would be dense, irregular kind of stuff, right? But this collagen fibers, stuff like that. This would be the muscularis externa. Right. And so over here, again, it gets a little complicated because we're still in a region where you have skeletal muscles and stuff. So we'll go back to the other one. In this case, this is the lumen where food would be going on through. You'd have the stratified squamous lining it. And again, you can kind of make out, even from up here, that muscularis mucosa. It's much thicker than it is in the other layers we'll see. Right. So stratified, this would be the mucosal epithelia. This would be the lamina propria sitting underneath it. Transition into the smooth muscle layer of the muscularis mucosa. And then you'd move over into your submucosa, right? Which is mostly collagen fibers as well as all the structures. Right over here, here's some mucosal glands, the submucosal glands. These are part of the ducts that you'd see. Again, if you could see the whole thing, you'd see they're leading out onto the surface there. Right, that's the submucosa, and then you get to your muscularis layer. Again, I'll use better, easier samples for all this. For the muscularis layer, but that's good submucosa, right? And then we're going to get to the junction again. You're going to go from a stratified squamous to a simple columnar, right? We look closely, right? We'll see that boundary between the stratified squamous, the esophagus, and then you'll see the simple columnar that's lining the epithelial here, right? So this would be the lining of the stomach, the structures, the small structures. You'll see here the gastric pits, right? We're in your stomach, so those are the gastric pits, right? So the simple columnar lines all this right there, right? They'd lead into the gastric glands, but we'll see better images of this in a second. Okay, so esophagus, stomach at the gastro-esophageal junction, stratified squamous to simple columnar, and we'll also have your gastric pit as a structure on these. So just recognize this boundary. It's the region where you're going to go from a stratified squamous to a simple columnar. The only other region, right, would be the rectal anal junction, the opposite way, right? So if this was proximal and this was distal, this might be the rectal anal junction, but this is proximal and this is proximal and this is distal. So food is going this way. This is the transition going from the esophagus to the stomach. All right, so then we're moving. There's a couple of different sections of the stomach. Right, this one will have that gastric fold, the major big fold that we could see macroscopically. That includes the submucosa going up here. All right, so this is the submucosa. Right, that's all the collagen fibers and stuff. And then you have a thin layer of the muscularis mucosa right here. And then you get into your mucosal membrane, right? This is the lamina propria, but with all the gastric gland material in it, right? Up at the top, you'd have the gastric pits up there. Okay, so that's the gastric fold over here. These would be like the gastric pits up there on top of that. Okay, and then move the transition from the submucosa. Again, you want to be able to recognize the transition from that dense, irregular connective tissue to a smooth muscle. Can everybody see that? Kind of the trend. There's something different about this. These two layers, like if I had a marking right here to here, and you knew that this was the lumen, then you know that this is the submucosa, and this is where you get to the muscular layer, right? The internal. And then you also want to be able to differentiate, see the transition from this orientation, and then the cross sections of the external layer over here, right? Where you can see this is the nuclei. You'll see a cross section of the nuclei, all right? Whereas this is the longitudinal view. Okay. The other section over here is going to have these other, this is also a single rugae right here. These are all the little gastric pits, right, lining them and the epithelial lining. And then these are the gastric glands. In this sample, we could easily tell the difference within the gastric glands of the two types of cells, right? The parietal cells and the chief cells, right? The parietal cells are going to be closer up toward the surface. They're going to be light stained, and more like lighter gray stained. Where you go down deeper, right? The chief cells are going to be darker stained. They're going to be closer to the basal part of it, right? The deeper part of the gastric pits and the intestinal glands there. All right, so the darker ones are the chief cells, lighter ones are the parietal cells. And again, you go up to the surface, and these are the gastric pits, right? Gastric pits, gastric glands, parietal cells, chief cells. And then we go from the gastro, again, we're going to go into the gastro-duodenal junction, stomach, duodenum, Mushu dragon. Right here, right? This over here is a gastric fold right here. It had gastric pits all over on the top of it right there. But over here, right, this is the this would look like it, right? That would be the mucosal membrane. This would be the little bit of a submucosa here. But this right here is all smooth muscle. This is the inner muscular layer that's going to form that internal sphincter, the pyloric sphincter right here. Pyloric sphincter leading from the stomach into the duodenum right there. Okay, so now we're in your duodenum. What you're looking at here are those Brunner's glands over here in the submucosa. All right, so if I were to tell you that this was the muscularis mucosa, then you'd know what's deep to it, or outside of it rather, is going to be the submucosa with these submucosal glands, which are in the duodenum. Those are the Brunner's glands, right? They even have it right here, Brunner's glands. Okay, you could also make out the inner and outer muscular layer right here. Another picture of the duodenum, a cross section over here, which shows all the Brunner's glands, which are all around here. They're here within the submucosa, and then moving on to the inner and outer muscular layer. Next region, 248. This is a nice sample because the collagen fibers are stained blue. So the submucosa is very easy to pick out right here, right? So the submucosa is going to extend into those circular folds or plicae circularis, right? And then on top of that, if we look really close, we'd see the muscularis mucosal layer over here, and then this would be the mucosal layer lined with, these are the villi that we're looking at here. So zoomed out, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 circular folds, and on top of those, you got all the villi, right? The finger-like projections. You know, the villi would be close in over here. The cells, these are simple columnar cells. On top of those, you might see right, this is the top layer right here would be the microvilli right here, the fuzzy kind of border. Right? This is actually the basement membrane is saying, so the lamina propria rather, would be where all the blood vessels and stuff are. All right, so just zoom in and out a little bit of that till you kind of get the feeling of that. What is everything right there? And over here is a clear boundaries between the submucosa, the mucosal layer, the submucosa, and the muscular layer here. Right, in this case, the intermuscular layer. This is the longitudinal view, so you'll see the cross sections of these, and you'll see the longitudinal views of the longitudinal muscles, right? Because this is the longitudinal view. Everybody get that transition? No? This is all the muscular layer. They're going to be running at cross angles to each other, right? These two muscular layers. So you're going to see the nuclei in cross section in one layer and the longitudinal view in the next layer. Right? If you look at those models right there, you just turn it, looking at the cross section, look at the longitude, and you'll see the orientation change. You can't identify it based on the orientation of that. You just want to know location-wise, this is closer to here's the lumen. This must be the inner layer. Right here, this is the outer layer, right? Or circular and longitudinal. But you could see easily here the transition, right? From submucosa to muscularis externa. Right. So interspersed within here, you got the goblet cells. These are the whiter cells within here. You also have intestinal crypts, like deeper inside. The intestinal crypts are going to be surrounded by the lamina propria, right over here, as opposed to the villi, which are surrounded by the lumen. This is where all the digestive particles are going to be getting absorbed in there. All right, so that's a nice section of your jejunum. The other last region of your small intestine here, 1, 2, 3 circular folds right over here, and you can clearly see the villi a little clearly right there, right? Yeah, I showed it in my video, on my slides, right? So over here are the villi, right? This is the circular fold that's going to include the submucosa up here. Again, the muscularis mucosa is that thin lining up here, and then you get the transition into the submucosa, right? Over here is all the mucosal layer lined by the simple columnar epithelia. All right, you move down here. This is where all the submucosa, all the blood vessels and stuff, and you see the transition from a submucosa into the muscular layer over here. And again, you can hopefully see the transition where you see the small dots over here for the nuclei and the elongated nuclei over here in the opposite orientation. Where are these? The crypts. Now you can see a little bit of the intestinal crypts over here. Well, we could also see what I want to point out here are the nodules, right? These gathering of white blood cells right underneath the mucosal epithelium right here. These are they're kind of span the lamina propria and the submucosa a little bit. But again, in this region over here, you want protection against any breach in here. The white blood cells over here will kind of set the alarm. They can deal with infiltrators, and they could also set the alarm for the rest of the immune system that there's been a breach. So often, if you see a lot of these in any one given sample, especially enlargements of it, that indicates an infection. If you go along the whole digestive tract, you're going to see a whole bunch of these clumps of cells, all these big dark gray groups of nuclei. These are all white blood cells, basically, that are lining here. That's what your tonsils look like, and so on. All right, but that's your ileum. And again, as far as the layers, here, submucosa, and then the muscularis externa, inner and outer layer. Okay. And then we move on to the large intestine. Over here, flat surface. Over here, the prominent feature are these crypts, the intestinal crypts, right? Which contain the intestinal glands. They'll also contain all the goblet cells. That's what these are right here, right? So the simple columnar will be on the outside. Goblet cells will be down here. Secrete mucus, right? So this is what's keeping everything moist down here. Again, here's a nice submucosa, a lot of blood vessels. When we get to identifying blood vessels, you'll be able to identify this as a big vein right over here because of the floppiness of it, right? Whereas like these more structured things are going to be arteries. But for right now, there's a lot of blood vessels dispersed within your collagen fibers right there. Right? So that's your submucosa. The other picture of the colon right here, again, this is farther down. You'll see a lot of the goblet cells. That's the clear ones over here, right? A lot of goblet cells. It makes up a lot more of them as you move along. The epithelial lining, the simple columnar will be up here. And then submucosa, again, then you get to your muscularis externa. The inner layer will be thicker for the most part, with the exception of these big enlargements of the external. These are what's going to create the haustrum that you see. If you look at the intestinal models, the large ones, you'll see the haustrum. They're the thin strips that you can see externally. That's actually the longitudinal layer over here. Okay, on the outside. So that's the cross section of the last region of your colon. And then, okay, we were moving through this last section. Now we're finally passing through The feces has been moving through here. It's going to change from a simple columnar and start toward the anal canal, where you're going to transition into a stratified squamous. Right, this doesn't look like a lot of the stratified squamous that we've seen, but it is, classified as squamous. It looks a little bit more like that transitional, but over here, as you move along here, you'll start to see it look more like your typical stratified squamous. As it goes closer toward the surface to the outer layer, and then you're going to see this transition from a stratified squamous wet into a dry as it moves out into the skin right there. Okay, so that's your recto-anal junction, right? And thankfully, we won't discuss anal glands or anything like that, because it's gross and why bother, right? All right, so that's it. That's it for your histology of the digestive system. Most of your histology is going to be on that. There's a few blood vessel ones, but otherwise, these are what you want to know for that.